Thank you very much, Marianne, Kevin, Xiaoheen, and the others that were on the lecture committee, faculty, and students, and possibly a few architect friends from Denver as well. Can't see as well from up here. I'm going to lecture on an aspect of Kahn's work that, like a similar aspect of most architects, both known and unknown, is almost never discussed, which is the work that doesn't get built. And in fact, my very large and fat book on Louis Kahn contains 12 projects. 6 of them are built and 6 are unbuilt. 12 that are built and 12 that are unbuilt, I should say. So we'll look at a few more unbuilts tonight. And the lecture title comes actually from Kahn, as you'll hear in a moment. Can everyone hear me all right? Or they're just watching the images. They're good images, though. Architecture is unquestionably among the most difficult of disciplines, balanced as it is between the incommensurable demands of art and science, and being the most public of acts, requiring the participation of many to realize, yet often originating in a single individual's poetic vision at the beginning. Even so, the number of unrealized designs among Louis Kahn's total commissions is unusually high, 150 unbuilt projects out of 230 total designs. And their quality, the quality of the unbuilt work, is simply staggering. I would maintain that if we were to leave aside Kahn's built works and evaluate only his unbuilt works, these unbuilt works, would still constitute one of the most significant contributions to 20th century architecture. As I was discussing with the students earlier today, architectural historians, critics, and practitioners have generally tended to ignore unbuilt designs by architects, being unwilling or unable to recognize either their theoretical insights, generative potential, or critical importance in an architect's development as a designer. It is my contention that the loss of our disciplinary history that is represented by the failure of educators, practitioners, critics, and historians to study and learn from these transformative works, unrealized only by chance and circumstance, is intellectually and culturally unsustainable. The insights and constructive concepts embodied in unbuilt designs, such as Le Corbusier's Venice Hospital, must be re-engaged in the discipline of architecture. As I mentioned in my comprehensive monograph on Kahn, I examined 12 major unbuilt works that I hold to be of equal importance as the 12 great built works that I present that we all know. As becomes clear when examining Kahn's architectural designs in chronological order, it was almost invariably in these pivotal, but almost never studied, unbuilt projects that Kahn first evolved the fundamental ordering concepts that he would later use as the foundation for his famous and most often studied built works. For Kahn, these unbuilt designs established the principles that would later characterize his built works, in the same way that the earliest archaic Greek temples are necessary for the realization of what we today consider the epitome of architecture of the period, the Parthenon. And about that, Kahn has to say, quote, "I do not believe that beauty can be deliberately created. Beauty evolves out of a will to be that has its first expression in the archaic. Compare Paestum to the Parthenon. Archaic Paestum is the beginning. It is the time when the walls parted and the columns became, and when music entered architecture. Paestum inspired the Parthenon. The Parthenon is considered more beautiful, but Paestum is still more beautiful to me. It presents a beginning within which is contained all the wonder that may follow in its wake." End quote. With that kind of thing, it's perhaps not so surprising to find that Kahn's attitude towards his own unrealized designs was one of unfailing optimism. Kahn's quote, which I have here, "That which is not built is not really lost. Once its value is established, its demand for presence is undeniable. It is merely waiting for the right circumstances." By studying the most important of Kahn's unbuilt designs, I've selected 14 out of the total of 150, or less than 1/10 of his unrealized commissions, and understanding the value they hold for contemporary architecture, we may be able to engage Kahn's vision of architecture as a new beginning in our own time. In the brief presentation of these 14 designs, I'll indicate the ordering principles that Kahn discovered for each unrealized design, and where appropriate, point to his later built works where these ordering principles were in fact realized and engaged. We begin with the Jewish Community Center in Trenton, New Jersey of 1954 to 1958. Kahn began the design of the main building by evolving a series of stacking and interlocking octagonal forms, even as the design of the bathhouse, which was the first to be built, developed as a cruciform plan of overlapping square volumes. In late 1955, Kahn presented the designs for the Trenton Jewish Community Center to two young faculty from the University of Texas, Austin, Colin Rowe, British architectural historian and critic trained by Rudolf Wittkover, and Robert Slutsky, American painter trained at Yale by Joseph Albers. These two young faculty told Kahn that it seemed he was trying to grow the building as an organic entity. And they suggested that based on the overlapping grid of the bathhouse, Kahn should rather look at the plans of Andre Palladio and what Kahn later called the bay system of room making. And Kahn went on to develop the definitive scheme for the main building based on a tartan, or a small, large, small bay system that you can see on the left, with 10-foot square column clusters that house the service spaces surrounding 20-foot square primary functional spaces. And this can be understood as the first articulation of one of Kahn's most important concepts, which was the idea of servant and served space. In the 1956 design for the community center, as well as in the bathhouse, which was finished that same year, each of the 20-foot square served spaces was covered by a pyramidal dome topped by a central oculus. And the inhabitants would have been able to clearly perceive the structure with which the rooms were made. By the way, the model on the lower right was made by graduate students at the University of Florida. I give these unbuilt projects by Kahn and Le Corbusier and others as studio projects to assume they're built and then to make additions to them as a way of studying them and treating them as possibly having been real. In the bathhouse, the four hollow columns at the corners held the services and entries and were the first clear example of this conception of servant and served. In 1953, Kahn had anticipated the implications of this little bathhouse design when he said, "In Gothic times, architects built with solid stones. Now we build with hollow stones." The community center and bathhouse's powerful definition of the space, of our experience of it, by the roof and the ceiling overhead, as Colin Rowe noted in his 1957 essay, Neoclassicism and Modern Architecture, went directly against the dominant definition of the free plan space of the modern movement, determined as it was by the flat slab and the column grid. Rowe noted that in his design, Kahn presents the most definitive solution to date for the desire to reintroduce overhead spatial structure with spatial cells, structural bays, and horizontal structural system and rhythm into modern architecture. This intention of Kahn's, which would characterize all his subsequent designs, originated in the 1,760 upview section axiometric diagrams of Auguste Choisy's Histoire de l'Architecture of 1899, the textbook that Kahn studied as a student and kept in his library and used in the office throughout his life. These drawings present architecture from throughout history and time as being focused on the formation of interior space through the fusing of the walls and the ceiling, the overhead surface as it generates the plan at the ground. This was a lesson that Kahn carried with him throughout his career, as evidenced by his statement to his students that the level of a civilization is registered in the height, shape, and structural order of its ceilings. The taller and more structural shaped, the more cultivated the society that it housed. Kahn made one further critically important discovery while working on the Trenton project, and that was a new way of making where structure and space were formed together. In 1944, in his essay Monumentality, Kahn had criticized standard I-section steel construction as lacking the ability to conform to the elegant shapes of the structural stress diagram that it was housing. At that time, he anticipated the newly emerging construction technology of precast concrete, pre-stressed and post-tensioned, could be capable of forming space and structure as an integrated design. Yet it was only late in 1956, during the time he was designing the Trenton project, that Kahn first met the structural engineer Auguste Commandant. Kahn brought his students to visit Commandant's concrete precasting plant that year, and he realized that the material held the key to simultaneously shaping inhabited space and monolithic structure. Kahn's final design for the Trenton project of 1958 employed precast concrete for the pyramidal domes and the folded plate longspan beams, which were carried by concrete masonry bricks and cast-in-place columns with large concrete masonry block non-bearing walls between, which you can see in the sketch lower left. Kahn first realized this new way of making that joined space and structure in his design for the University of Pennsylvania Medical Laboratories in 1957, extending to 1962, where the entire structural frame was built with precast and post-tension concrete, which, by the way, had to be assembled by steel workers because there was no one who understood how to put precast concrete pieces together up in the air. During the construction, Kahn was asked by his fellow colleague, Eero Saarinen, whether this construction site that they were watching, you see the middle photograph on the bottom, was an architectural or a structural design, to which Kahn, of course, answered that for him, they were one and the same. Late in life, Kahn returned to this early concept of a field of pyramidal top-lit domes of the Trenton project in his design for the upper floor of the Yale Center for British Art of 1969 to 74, which was the last project that Kahn saw built. I mentioned this project to the students earlier today. In the design for the United States Embassy in Angola of 1959 to 62, Kahn began with his observation regarding the way in which the inhabitants of the city of Luanda dealt with the intensely bright and hot sunlight. He noted that the residents turned away from the glare of the direct sunlight coming through the windows and worked with the indirect light that was bounced off the walls. He also recognized the environmental intelligence of the traditional Angolan construction system that provided a ventilated space between the upper level top roof and the second rain roof, which so as to allow the heat from the sunlight striking the roof to be exhausted and not taken into the interior of the building. Kahn's design for the embassy and residence for the ambassador involved a system of double layers of protection from the heat and the glare of the sun. A double roof of sunroof above rain roof, and a double walls of precast concrete sun shields, he called them, surrounding glazed volumes within. These are Kent Larson's digital reconstructions, which I'll be using off and on throughout. The porous tree-like shade canopy of the roof, constructed of bands of clay tile leaves, as he called them, with a narrow slot between, would have characterized the experience of the half of the interior volume that was actually open to the roof and open air in that case, with the diffused light punctured by thin lines of direct light only at noon. Even more porous sun shield walls, articulated by semicircular openings at their top, stand 10 feet in front of the full-height glazed walls of the surrounding and enclosed spaces, through which the inhabitants would have been able to see both framed views of the landscape, as you can see in some of these reconstructions, as well as the play of light and shadow in the light court itself. And this emerged from Kahn's most important conceptual realization of this project, quote, "I thought of wrapping ruins around the buildings," end quote. This pivotal discovery of the ability of architectural layers to both temper the environment and enrich interior experience was realized by Kahn's design for the Rochester Unitarian Church of 1959 to 69, lower right, where he surrounded the central sanctuary with a series of classrooms that are formed by folded masonry that both shaded the window openings and provided habitable niches, particularly for children at the bottom from the inside. Kahn's early rejection of mechanical air conditioning paralleled his realization that buildings in hot, humid climates could be made habitable through natural ventilation and shading, a realization that led to Kahn's designs for the works such as the Indian Institute of Management of 1962 to 74, center lower photograph, where the covered open-air spaces of circulation, which take up half the building, allow the inhabitants to experience the prevailing breezes. The design for the meeting house of Salk Institute, this is the unrealized third part of Salk Institute, in La Jolla, California of 1959-65 were the result of the request of the client, Jonas Salk, that Kahn design the most advanced scientific laboratories as well as a place where Salk could invite Picasso to meet his scientists. This request arose from Salk's understanding that breakthroughs in science often occur when scientists are confronted with someone possessing an entirely different worldview and a way of evaluating things. Thus the idea of bringing Picasso to meet the scientists. The early perspective view, the largest image here, of the entire Salk Institute complex clearly indicates that for Kahn, the meeting house, seen close in the foreground at the edge of the ocean, was by far the most important element of the overall design, while the laboratories are seen in the distance, literally in the background on the left of the meeting house. The plan of the meeting house presents yet another new discovery for Kahn, the conception of a plan as an assembly of independent, self-structured volumes or buildings, rather loosely gathered around a square courtyard in this case. With its square regular center and irregular outer edge, the plan represents a new way of composing spaces for Kahn, one that allowed individual rooms to be read clearly while also establishing a sense of interior spatial structure ordered by the central courtyard. A second conceptual discovery in this design is the way the independent room buildings are joined together with an extensive set of spaces for circulation and informal meeting, what Kahn called the architecture of connection, which is equal in dimension to the enclosed primary volumes. And that becomes a fairly typical thing for almost all of Kahn's later buildings. Both these insights into plan making were at least partly inspired by the full-size imaginary reconstruction of the Campus Martius section of ancient Rome, the center of ancient Rome, made by Giambattista Piranesi in 1762, which Kahn hung on the wall of his personal office in Philadelphia, directly across from his desk. So if you see Kahn at his desk, the photographer that took the photograph has his or her back to this Campus Martius full size, which is about the size you see on the screen actually. Piranesi's plan, which is composed of an endlessly varied set of clusters and assemblies of pure geometric forms, filled Kahn's field of vision whenever he looked up from his own drawings. At the edge of the meeting house overlooking the Pacific Ocean, Kahn placed a series of cylindrical concrete sun shields housing cubic, full-height glazed reading rooms for the library, as well as a series of rectangular concrete sun shields housing cylindrical, full-height glazed dining rooms. The inner glazed rooms were to be given wooden shutters for control of the microclimate, and the outer sun shield walls were to be built of cast-in-place concrete with travertine stone insets, denoting the honorific status of these rooms. From the courtyard open to the sky and centering in the building exactly like the Renaissance Palazzo, to the cylindrical glazed dining rooms that are set within their square outer shell walls, of which Kahn said there is no better seminar room than a dining room. The meeting house was organized to allow the scientists to engage larger issues outside of their laboratories. As Kahn said, it's, quote, essentially Salk Institute is a laboratory building, but you must not forget that that place of meeting is of utmost importance. The ordering of independent room buildings around a central honorifically dominant primary volume to form a regular center and irregular outer edge, the joining together of these independent volumes with the architecture of connections, and the concept of freestanding cast concrete sun shields forming shaded spaces, protecting glazed apertures within. All these concepts were developed for the meeting house and would later be realized in Kahn's assembly building of the Bangladesh National Capital at Dhaka of 1962-74, the lower right corner. Kahn's first design for the unrealized University of Virginia Chemistry Building, 1960-63, indicates the generally unacknowledged importance of Frank Lloyd Wright for Kahn, as the plan is very close to that of Wright's 1906 Unity Temple. Kahn's definitive design, which I'm showing here, for the chemistry building, proposed a central court with faculty offices lining both sides, not unlike Salk laboratories, but also related clearly to Thomas Jefferson's original building of the University of Virginia, which is nearby. Along the outer edge of the plan, behind the faculty offices, Kahn placed two long laboratory volumes, the structure for which was an attempt to reuse the laboratory structure originally proposed for Salk Institute, which is the small photograph in the lower right. A precast concrete folded plate structure that would house the services in its deep V-shaped ceiling and allowing light to enter between the structural beams on the upper floor. This elegant folded plate structure, which was fully worked out for the Salk laboratories by Commandant, was abandoned after the decision was made to not build a meeting house. Kahn said he felt a terrible sense of loss when they could not employ this structural design at Salk, and he continued to endeavor to deploy it on subsequent projects, including the chemistry building. And it would ultimately evolve into the curved gull-wing-shaped cast concrete roof shell structure of the Kimball Museum of 1966 to 72, the diagram on the lower right, where the initial idea of bringing light in at the center of the vault would also be realized. Kahn's unbuilt designs for the Mikveh Israel Synagogue, which was intended to be built in his hometown of Philadelphia from 1961 to 72, which I might add, according to his daughter Sue-Ann Kahn, it was the project that hurt him the most in not getting built. These are all characterized by the sanctuary being formed by a series of cylindrical light-filled chambers. In the early stages, these cast concrete light chambers, you can see in some of my diagrams on the upper right made at the Kahn archives, these light chambers seem to float above the ground at the outer edge of the building, clearly indicating their non-structural nature. This is emphasized by the slices of light that cut the cylinder chambers away from the, that you can see a little bit in Kahn's sketch on the lower right, that cut the cylindrical light chambers themselves away from the solid structural sidewalls of the sanctuary. On the inner walls of the cylindrical light chambers, Kahn designed a series of arched openings with the curves at the top and the bottom, reversed arches that suggest the non-structural nature also of those arches. The erosion of the concrete shells by light and the arc of the sun as it crosses the sky. The ceiling roof of Kahn's design proposed a structure that was elliptical in both plan and section. An internal hidden truss with top and bottom faces of cast concrete. Very similar to Le Corbusier's Ronchamp Chapel, which Kahn had first visited in 1959, and contrary to almost all other religious structures, the ceiling comes down into the sacred space, catching the light from the cylindrical light chambers to the side, as you can see in Kent's reconstruction. These cylindrical light chambers are perhaps the best example of what Kahn called light-giving walls. Inside the synagogue, the inhabitants would have had no eye-level views out, and the sunlight would have been direct and bounced off the curved walls, seeming to come from all sides, all directions, so that solar orientation would become confused. In this space, the inhabitants would be detached from their surroundings, distanced from the outside world, floating in a sea of light. This conception of cylindrical light chambers protecting and illuminating internal rooms would be realized in Kahn's designs for the assembly building at Dhaka, particularly in the prayer hall, lower right, where 4 cylindrical light chambers illuminate a cubic prayer room. A similar conception is at work in the light courts around which the offices are arrayed in the model you can see, and the light chambers that occur at the hollow spaces of the structural buttresses in the assembly hall itself. This is the image that was on the poster, I think. The Levy Memorial Playground, which was developed from 1961 to 66 and proposed to be built in Riverside Park in New York, was designed by Kahn in association with the Japanese-American sculptor Isamu Noguchi. And you see them there on the site in the upper left photo. Noguchi introduced Kahn to the use of plasticine clay, which Kahn immediately adopted for his site models. And as a result, all of Kahn's later projects show a dramatically increased emphasis on the initial marking of the ground, on the making of an anchored base or plinth for the building, and on the engagement of the earth as the first act of construction. In summarizing their 6 often frustrating years of collaborative work, when they were repeatedly blocked from realizing their designs by Robert Moses, the park and highway planner of the city, Kahn said, quote, "I did not speak in terms of architecture. He, Noguchi, did not speak in terms of sculpture. Both of us felt the building as a contour, not one contour, but an interplay of contours, so folding and harboring as to make, by such a desire, no claim to architecture, no claim to sculpture." these projects are waiting for the right circumstance. It's my understanding that Jonas Salk's son is currently fundraising to build this in New York in Riverside Park. The Interama, Inter-American Community, designed in 1963 to 69 for Miami, Florida, was part of a large exposition site involving buildings by many of the leading architects in the US. Ian Pei and Marcel Breuer were quite close by Kahn's project. Kahn's proposal was for a powerful series of independent building volumes that framed a triangular plaza with views across the bay to downtown Miami. A line of what he called houses of nations, whose Y-shaped plans housed naturally ventilated exhibition and cultural spaces, marched along the western side of the site, forming small courtyards at the water's edge. The main building at the southern end of the site, with the central sunken court and pinwheeling stairs, employed servant and serve spaces in both plan and section upper right. Of particular note are the X-shaped structural beams that you can see in the section that encircle the top of the main space, which in addition to carrying the roof and housing ventilation ducts, also act to bounce the sunlight into the central room. The conception of an articulated, naturally vented, inhabited masonry wall framing a public space would be realized in Kahn's designs for the members' hotels and dining halls of the Bangladesh National Capital, the brick buildings that are visible in the aerial photograph of 72, unfinished at that time. The Dominican Motherhouse was designed for Media, Pennsylvania in 1965 to 69, and is a recomposition and transformation of both the traditional program and building type of the convent. As can be seen in the Salk Institute and the Indian Institute of Management, Kahn believed that the monastic plan was an appropriate type for use in housing many other programs. But this was his first chance to design an actual monastic enclave. In an early drawing, after developing his typical series of independent room buildings, Kahn took the logical next step. It's a lower right drawing. He took the logical next step in this way of making plans, which was to cut them apart with scissors so as to be able to freely rearrange them as a collage. The resulting plan has a regular outer edge formed by the walls of the cells of the sisters, as you can see in the upper right, and an irregular center where Kahn has placed the common rooms such as chapel, refectory, library, and schoolrooms in what would, in a traditional convent, have been the open courtyard. The result is a reversal of his own plan for the Salk Institute Meeting House with its irregular outer edge and regular center. The result is also an inversion of the traditional plan of the monastic type. Kahn proposed the Dominican Motherhouse to be built with masonry bearing wall construction using flat jack arches over the windows and door openings. These are redrawn elevations done by my students, with openings becoming larger and piers becoming smaller as it rises to reflect the diminishment of the structural loads. This method of constructing statically hierarchical load-bearing walls that represent the diminishment or increase of their load would be realized, of course, in Kahn's design for Exeter Library, lower right, of 1965 to 72, while the conception of a plan as a collision of independent pure volumes would be realized in Kahn's Fisher House of 1967, the photo next to it on lower right. The Kansas City office tower of 1966 to 74 was one of Kahn's very few attempts to come to terms with the dominant building type of his time, the high-rise office tower. Kahn felt that typical steel frame high-rise construction was not substantial enough, calling the buildings of Mies van der Rohe and SOM tin can construction. For Kansas City, Kahn and Commandant proposed to build a 24-story tower using slip-form concrete construction, which would have been less expensive and required less time to build than steel construction. 4 corner double columns would have supported a post-tensioned truss structure at the roof, and the building would have been constructed from the top down with reusable formwork, slipping down, and you see Kahn's drawing of the actual construction process. A particular note was Kahn's provision of a smaller scale spaces at the street edges to mitigate the large scale of the tower in the city. In 1974, SOM convinced the client to give them the project. Kahn, who was not informed of this decision for some time, continued to work on the design. For Kahn, this episode exemplified, as he told Stanley Tigerman, the last person to see him alive, in London, this exemplified what is wrong with our profession: no ethics. And he was a close personal friend of Nat Owens. Kahn's sketch for the drawing of the top of the Kansas City office tower, at the lower right, showing people on the rooftop terrace above the curving catenary roof truss, was transferred to his later Palazzo del Congressi project, which we'll see in a minute, and his concept of building a tower from the top down and hanging the floors of an office building would inspire a number of other architects, to name only one, the design of Norman Foster for the Hong Kong-Shanghai Bank. The memorial to 6 million Jewish martyrs, to be built in New York at the tip of the island, 1966 to 72, in the original Battery Park, proposed a series of glass cubes 10 feet on a side, which would transmit light while also casting light-filled shadows. Kahn intended to build a memorial using a woven structure of 6-inch by 6-inch by 6-foot long cast glass blocks, which would have been cloudy and finished with a non-reflective surface. So the plexiglass that he used to make the models is quite accurate in that sense. The glass blocks would have been assembled without mortar, using interlocking pin and hole jointing, like the marble sections of a column of a Greek temple. In describing the quality of light he intended for the project, Kahn described the experience of the Pantheon in Rome. Quote, "The light is so strong as to feel its cut." End quote. In this, Kahn seemed to suggest that he conceived of the cast glass as a frozen or solidified light, which had been cut and shaped into masonry blocks. The whole design is a monument to light, massive, thick, translucent light. One of Kahn's greatest unrealized projects is the design for the Herba Synagogue, proposed to be built in Jerusalem and worked on from 1967 to 74, 74 being the year of his death. Sited on the hill opposite the Temple Mount, Kahn carefully kept the height of the building no more than the two great religious sites of Islam, the Dome of the Rock, and of Christianity, the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, which stand atop the Temple Mount. And you can see both in the section that he drew and in the plasticine model that he made of the city of Jerusalem, how he's keeping that height, using that height as a kind of a cutoff point for his project. You have to remember that at this point there is no major synagogue of the same stature as the two buildings on the Temple Mount in Jerusalem. So this is an attempt to have a third house for the third religion that claims Jerusalem. Kahn painstakingly made a large site plan, site section, and clay model of the entire central section of ancient Jerusalem to assure his design was appropriate to the larger context. The design is remarkably introverted. The outer wall is composed of 16 massive pylons made of Jerusalem stone, the same stones that are used to build the western wall of the Temple Mount, off of which the sunlight would have bounced to enter the sanctuary within, giving it a golden glow. One would have entered the synagogue at the corners between these battered pylons, remarkably similar, these pylons that are remarkably similar to those on Egyptian temples, and that these pylons housed small chapels at their bases, small so-called candle chapels. Inside, 4 massive concrete umbrella-like roof structures, hollow, lightless, and dark, define but do not enclose the space of the sanctuary. Its square and cruciform plan. The 4 umbrella-like roof structures would not have touched, and light would have entered the sanctuary through the thin slots between the edges of the beveled concrete and the roof shells. So I told Kent the slots are a bit too large, but that's okay. It's pretty compelling. The structure joins modern reinforced hollow concrete construction to ancient battered wall masonry mass and brings to mind Kahn's debt to Le Corbusier and the remarkably prescient statement that Kahn wrote in 1965, shortly before he learned of Le Corbusier's death that same year, which is as much about Kahn's own architecture, I would argue, as about anything Le Corbusier might design. Quote, "The stark architectural directness of the castle and the musically rhythmic image of the Greek temple combines in my mind a thought about Le Corbusier. I believe Le Corbusier, even in light of his marvelous revelations in architecture, is just beginning to make his greatest work. I dare to think of a building he might make, a great block of a building, which is cut into from top to bottom in varied places of varied shapes, neither forgetting the castle nor the order of the temple, giving light to spaces and passages on the immediate interior and leading to a glorious central and single space, the walls and their light left in faceted planes, the shapes the record of their making, intermingled with the serenity of light from above, end quote. I have to say, there are a few statements by one architect of another architect's work of that kind of poetic power. At the time of Kahn's death in 1974, Jerusalem Mayor Teddy Kollek had just written to Kahn of his eagerness to start the building of the Herva Synagogue. The concept of the umbrella-like concrete roof shells, an idea that Kahn had been interested in since he visited Wright's Johnson Wax Building in 1959, which was built in 1936, but which he only visited in 59, were realized in a very different form in the Olivetti Underwood factory, lower right, of 1966 to 70, on which the young Italian architect Renzo Piano worked with Kahn. Piano is now designing, of course, at the time I wrote this, he was designing the addition to the Kimball Museum, which is another discussion altogether. The Palazzo del Congressi, designed for Venice, Italy, in 1968 to 74, began with Kahn's clay site model of the city of Venice, upper right, with only 3 monuments that are clearly legible: the Piazza San Marco, Le Corbusier's Venice Hospital, which at that time was still intended to be built and was under development by his partners, and Kahn's Palazzo dei Congressi on the original site he was offered, which was the Biennale Giardini site, where the biennales are held. In the heavily treed Giardini site, Kahn proposed an elevated Congress Hall and an artist's workshop on the ground. Plan on the right, lower right. The curving floor of the elevated Congress Hall was inspired by Kahn's studies in 1950 of the bowl-shaped Campo in Siena, as well as suggesting a large bridge hanging down rather than rising up as those in Venice. The floor structure of the Congress Hall was to be a post-tension cast concrete slab in the form of a catenary curve, almost exactly as he first proposed in his sketches for the top of the Kansas City office tower. Italy being Italy, the Biennale Giardini site proposed by the city was then rejected by the city. And the city asked Kahn to redesign his idea, or the project of the Palazzo dei Congressi, for a site in the city-owned Arsenale, at that point not being used by the Biennale as it is now, the former shipbuilding precinct of the Venetian Empire. Here Kahn was able to propose that the Palazzo dei Congressi span across the canal, giving the conception of the suspended Congress Hall a much clearer rationale. On the roof of the building, above the 3 smaller domes, Kahn proposed an elevated garden and a viewing terrace, together with the interior of the Congress Hall, understood as a kind of piazza bridge, and the roof terrace, the 2 engaged Kahn's friend Aldo van Eyck's insight, in that little diagram in the upper right, that when people occupy hilltops, they face outwards to the distant view, as on the top of the building. And when they occupy valleys, they face, such as the curving Congress Hall, they face inwards towards each other and are gathered together into the space. During the time Kahn worked on the Palazzo dei Congressi, he was invited to give a lecture on the roof of the Doge's palace. We should all be so lucky, where he was able to observe at close hand the lead roofing of San Marco Basilica. Noting that this roof had lasted 1,000 years on these curving forms, Kahn said he felt it was certainly appropriate for use in a contemporary building. And based on his notes as to the sheet sizes and installation methods, Kahn used the same material and methods of installation on the curving roof of his Kimball Museum, lead-coated zinc in this case. The Palazzo dei Congressi was also the first late design where Kahn proposed, rather than deeply recessing the glazing, a flush glaze, facade, and stainless steel skin, both of which he would later employ on the Yale Center for British Art. Okay. The design for the Graduate Theological Union Library in Berkeley, California of 1971 to 74 was intended to house, and in fact today does house, the world's largest collection of books on religion. In many ways is a return to Kahn's 1956 design, unsuccessful competition design for the Washington University Library, which was a pyramid of books proposed at Washington University as glass, but here proposed in concrete a pyramid for books, but in this case also housing an Exeter library-like central vertical space that you can see in the section. Kahn proposed here for the first time that the apertures of the building would be shaded by rows of trees, what he called a green filter, that incorporates a garden into the building fabric. This late design had only reached a very preliminary stage when Kahn died, and the building was later realized in a significantly modified form, photo in the lower left, by local architects from 1977 to 87. While the resulting building follows Kahn's design in general massing, almost none of his specific ideas from the preliminary design were actually employed. The result may best be described as a bit of a caricature of Kahn's design. While in my monograph on Kahn, I published in 2005, I said the library, even in its modified form, should be considered Kahn's last built work. Having recently revisited the building, I have now come to the opposite conclusion and feel it's best that Kahn's unbuilt designs remain so, unless they can be realized as closely as possible to how he left them. Which brings me to the last project. The Franklin Delano Roosevelt Memorial, proposed for the southern point of Roosevelt Island in the East River of New York in 1973 and 74. His site is within view of the United Nations buildings, as you can see in his sketch. And this project represented a return to beginnings for Kahn, who had begun his career as a housing architect for Roosevelt's New Deal, designing more than 2,500 housing and government-sponsored apartments projects by the year 1945. As the client noted in hiring Kahn, quote, "Kahn loved Roosevelt and knew more about him than most of us." Kahn's conception of this memorial came early and clearly, quote, "I had this thought that a memorial should be a room and a garden. The garden is somehow a personal nature, a personal kind of control of nature, a gathering together of nature, and the room is the beginning of architecture," end quote. The site is entered from the north end, where we would move through a long, downward sloping perspectival garden, appearing longer than it is in fact. At the other end is a roofless room, set out into the river, made of massive stones opening to the south. Kahn proposed, actually, in his models, you can see them here, 2 statues of Roosevelt. A life-size standing figure we would encounter outside the stone room, and a larger than life-size figure of Roosevelt sitting in a wheelchair we would encounter upon entering the stone room on the inside and opposite side. The 60-foot square room is a truly archaic space with 12-foot tall walls that are 6 feet thick, made of solid granite blocks. The room at once both monumental, scale to the city, and intimate, scale to the human figure standing at the center of the river. So I end the lecture with 3 endings. The first is the last words in my book, written in 2003, published 2005, on Kahn. After Kahn's death in 1974, the Roosevelt Memorial design, like all of Kahn's unbuilt projects, was abandoned. Recent events, however, hold out some hope that perhaps this extraordinary design of Kahn's may yet be built. Second ending, written in 2009. Yet Kahn's design of the room and the garden was completed through construction documents, ready to be built, and fundraising efforts continued for more than a decade. In the 1980s, the basic work of grading the island point was accomplished before, under the supervision of Romaldo Jurgala, before the funding was exhausted. Then, this is in 2009, 1 year ago, construction began in earnest on the memorial, with test trees being planted on the edges of the island and the foundations of the room being cast. And again, written in 2009, the memorial is expected to be completed in the next several years, beginning with the room. And then the most recent time I've given this lecture was in 2012, and it was on the same day as the opening ceremony, to which I was invited by the Kahn family. Pouring rain in February, rain from the side, and I gave the lecture still drenched from the rain. And I have to say that my experience of this is that it's a miracle. This is a miracle. It's built so well. So what Kahn would say, of course, about this miracle, is that the design's demand for presence is undeniable. It was merely waiting for the right circumstances. Thank you.